Today I'm going to be removing and replacing the turbo I've been currently running on my BEW TDI. I'm doing this because the turbo is too close to my steering components, and after driving the Wrangler for a while, I noticed that steering knuckle, all the plastics and rubbers were getting really soft. I went on to powertdi.pl and I'm replacing this turbo with a GTD1752vrk. The other reason I decided to get a turbo from this website, one, it came highly recommended, but they were able to mount the turbo to the manifold in the position that I needed. To finish removing my current turbo, I had to remove the oil drain line and everything just so I had enough room to remove the turbo without having to lift the engine. With the turbo gone, I then can remove the exhaust manifold.
So I have the original turbo off. This has been a great turbo. I actually really like it. I'm going to be keeping this and using this on a different build. Really happy with this, but it's just not set up for what I'm trying to do with this specific build. Now on to the new turbo. Now this is all integrated. It's been welded to the manifold. This thing is quite a bit bigger and heavier, but one of the key differences on this turbo is the exhaust outlet is much bigger. That should really help reduce heat and get as much heat out of this engine bay and out of the exhaust and out the back as quick as possible. So this should flow a lot better. The other unique thing about this turbo is you'll notice these two lines here. This is actually a water-cooled turbo. So the reason for that is it just helps the longevity of the bearing and everything in the turbo. It doesn't actually cool down the EGTs at all. It's purely for reliability for the center section of the turbo. So I'm going to move the camera back and figuring out how I'm going to hook up this and the drain and everything else.
I first had to remove the AM fitting and reinstall the original oil drain fitting back into my BEW TDI, and then I went about cleaning the mating surfaces and installing the new exhaust gaskets that were supplied with the turbo. I had to clearance two of the exhaust manifold gaskets because of my intake manifold, then I was able to install the turbo. One thing I immediately noticed was the third bolt from the left on the top side of the exhaust manifold was a real trick to figure out how I was going to get installed. I ended up having to use a 1/4 inch drive with a flexi joint going underneath the turbo through the manifold to get that one nut installed onto the block. After securing all the nuts onto the turbo to my engine, I started to pre-lube the turbo so the first time I fired it up, it would already have oil in the center section.
I have the new turbo bolted to the engine. There's still a lot I have to do to get it up and running, but I wanted to show you just how much better this turbo fits compared to my old one. So I'm going to flip the camera around real quick. Here's the new turbo. One of the reasons why I went to this new setup was the old turbo was very close to this steering knuckle right here. I could barely get a finger in between this metal piece, the bracket that holds the knuckle, and the turbo housing. And there were times where I could tell the rubber was getting really, really hot, and I was worried about the nylon and rubber breaking down from all the heat exposure from the turbo. But this turbo actually fits surprisingly well. It was a little awkward to get into place because of that piece of the turbo, but I have plenty of room up here. I could almost rotate the starter to a different position, but it's easy to get to, and it looks like it's going to fit very well. When I started looking into how I was going to route the two water lines, I realized I've hooked up all my coolant lines to the point where it actually has a deadhead, meaning the hot side of the coolant is trying to be pushed into the cold side of the coolant, and it's actually right around my heater core, which explains why I've had so many problems trying to purge the air out of the coolant system every time I put water into it. So I'm gonna have to figure out how to completely redo my entire cooling system, because right now it's not right. It's actually done incorrectly. Good morning. So yesterday I left off with realizing I had a design flaw in the way I hooked up the cooling system on my swap. So I went out this morning and got a whole lot of parts, pieces, a lot of wide pieces and joiners and couplers and everything, so I can try to fix the deadhead situation I have with my cooling system, and so I can also hook up the water for my turbo setup as well. I also picked up a flexi joint for the downpipe that I need to make for the turbo. With that said, I'm going to move the camera and just start getting to work.
This coolant issue has actually been plaguing me for quite a while. I noticed whenever I was driving my BEW TDI, it never overheated, but I had huge temperature drops whenever the thermostat opened. Normally you'd see a drop of 10 to 20 degrees, and I was seeing closer to 50-degree drops. So having to figure this out was actually a good thing. Now, what I did was unhooked all the lines going to the heater core. I spliced in a Y adapter to my main return line to the radiator, and then I started just rerouting the lines off of the lines going to the heater core and the lines coming off the oil cooler so everything would flow in the correct direction.
Good morning, everyone. I went to the parts store and I got this long, expensive hose, really for that piece there, but there are other parts on this hose that I'm going to be using. And I'm going to be using that to feed this return line back into the hot section of what I am doing. The other thing I've decided is I don't like the way I supplied water to the turbo. I'm going to flip the camera around real quick. I put in a 3-way Y union here and it's evenly split, but I don't think that's going to supply water the way I want it to. So this is the water pipe, and my hands are in the way. Okay, now you can kind of see this. Come on, focus. I had welded the end of this pipe because the original adapter I was using with the original transmission wouldn't allow the pipe to go around back. I'm going to take this pipe off, drill and tap a fitting into the end here to supply water to this turbo supply line. And I'm doing that because I think that's going to be the best way to guarantee a good water flow to the turbo as well. I have the pipe out and I was actually able to get it out without removing any of the accessories, which saved so much time. So what I'm now going to do is set it up in, I say it's a new drill press. This is actually a vintage drill press that I recently got from a really good friend. But I'm going to get it all set up in here so I can drill and tap a hole in the top so I can put a 1/8" barb fitting to supply cold water to the turbo. All right, I have the threads tapped. I also realized after I tapped the threads that instead of taking video, I took a picture on my camera, so I apologize about that. So that's basically what I was trying to do. I got this right angle piece with a, I believe, a 3/8" barb fitting, and that will supply cold water up to the turbo. Got the hard pipe reinstalled on my BEW TDI. Ran out to the store real quick, needed a coupler for the one hose that I cut and spliced into, but then decided that's not how I wanted to feed cold water into the turbo. But I went to a different parts store and they had a hose that's going to work perfectly for how I want to return the hot coolant back into my coolant loop. So I'm going to move the camera and get back to work.
This last hose that I got from the parts store ended up being exactly what I needed in more ways than I expected. I ended up using most of the molded section of that hose as well to clean up all the cooling lines in my engine bay. Now, I don't know if you can tell this, but I'm taking my time cutting hoses as small as I can and test fitting everything just because I want to make sure I get everything right. I actually spent quite a bit of time trying to get the hot side of the coolant line of the turbo set up correctly before I realized I could just cut that stainless steel braided line so it would fit better in my engine bay. The last thing I did is I used the remaining pieces of the molded hose to redo the cooling lines around the oil cooler and my heater core. So except for the exhaust, I have the turbo installed. I have the oil feed line run, I have the drain line run, and I now have the coolant lines run. This is
the cold side coming in here, and this is the hot side going into here, which is going into my heater core. On this side, I modified the hard line down there by drilling and tapping an 1/8" MPT with a 3/8 inch barb. I have a molded hose supplying coolant to the turbo, and the molded hose keeps everything nice and tidy. The other thing I have done is this piece here. I have rerouted the heating system so I no longer have coolant coming into both the top and bottom of my heater core, causing a deadhead. So now this is a true loop. And the other thing I've done, and I don't know how well you can see it, I've redone the hose that's supplying cold coolant to the cooler for the oil, and I've put on another molded hose for the hot side coming up to this Y coupler as well. And because it's molded, it's cleaned up everything in the engine bay. So here's what's left to do to get this new turbo finally installed. I have to install the new ECU, which I haven't done yet. It's sitting on my workbench over there. The other big project is the exhaust. When I first did this project and got it running with the Kubota diesel engine years ago, I kind of cheated on the exhaust system by using one of those big slinky flex exhaust pipes, and I really want to get rid of that. So when I go to make the downpipe and everything, I'm also going to be removing that pipe, which is between my muffler and catalytic converter. But that's going to be in a few days when I have some more free time. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again sometime soon. Goodbye.